Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today's video was requested quite a while ago, but I took some time to make sure that the templates I'm sharing with you are perfectly optimized. I'm very satisfied with the results, so I'm really excited to finally share them with you. Let me just say a couple of important things before we start. First of all, what do I mean by best templates for HOI4 in 2024? Now, there is no such thing as an absolute best template in HOI4. What's best always depends on several factors, ranging from the skill of the player, to the playstyle, the country played, the resources available, and so on. So the templates I'm sharing with you today are the ones that work best for me in my single player runs. They are very balanced and will perform well in most situations, but they're also flexible and can be adjusted to better fit specific needs. This leads directly to the second point I would like to mention. This video will be a bit longer than usual, because I would like to explain in detail how I suggest using these divisions, and what adjustments you can make depending on the situation. You can use chapters to easily navigate to the templates you're interested in, or you can skip directly to the end of this video for a 50 seconds recap with all templates. Finally, if you wish to remain updated on future changes and improvements, please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I know every YouTuber asks you to do so, but likes and comments really help the video perform well, meaning the channel will grow faster and I will be able to make more content for you guys. Now let's get into the actual templates, starting from the ones I use more frequently. Now, as we start checking out my division templates, I will start with my offensive infantry divisions. Let me add one last thing. You will notice that I included several combat widths up here. I did it for each template. These are the optimal combat widths as of the latest version of the game. Now, I will talk about combat widths more in detail in another dedicated video. For now, all you need to know is that these widths will benefit our divisions more than others. That being said, I encourage you not to be too obsessed about combat widths. It's not like anything which does not match these widths is complete garbage, like many meta players seem to believe. Combat widths are only one of the many factors that determines the effectiveness of a division. So don't worry too much about it. Another important thing that I would like to mention is that the final stats of these divisions are affected by several things, including the technologies and doctrines, so do not worry if you do not get exactly the same stats. Now, let's talk about my offensive infantry and also why it is at the top of my list. Now, I would say that this offensive infantry division is probably the most common one throughout my runs. It's what I use in almost every run. And that's because it's very viable and flexible in all situations. Now, at the beginning of a run with a new country, I ask myself whether I have the economy, the industry, to build armored divisions in time for World War II. And if the answer to that question is no, then I always go for offensive infantry first. And then I build armored divisions later on in the game, whenever I can afford them. This division template works particularly well with superior firepower, due to the fact that it buffs the artillery and the support artillery battalions. In this way we can get a very high final soft attack, which is one of the most important, if not the most important stat in single player. The battalions are pretty self-explanatory. Mind that there are several variations to this template. So first of all, you can remove one artillery battalion to bring the combat width to 27. It's technically even slightly better than 30 width, but it has slightly worse stats, so in the end it's basically the same thing. It's a bit more difficult to go down to 25 combat width, but you can do it by replacing one artillery with an anti-air. In this way you get down to 25 combat width, which is another pretty good combat width, especially in the mountains. But we'll talk about it a bit later. Another thing you can do, if you prefer, you can achieve a combat width of 30 even by adding 3 more infantry battalions and removing 2 artillery battalions. As you can see, in this way we get less soft attack. On the other hand, we compensate with more HP, organization, recovery rate, and a lot more defense and breakthrough. So this is another very solid template that you can use in case you do not have the industry to produce enough artillery for 4 support artillery battalions. Okay, let's go back to my default one. However, I prefer this one because it's a bit more offensive. And let's look at the support companies that we are using. I would always use the engineer company. Look at the bonuses down there. They are insane. It's true, this is late in the game. You need some technologies to achieve these bonuses. but in my opinion they are just too good to skip. Plus I really like the defensive bonuses you get earlier in the game. Next, the support artillery. This is another obvious choice. A very good buff to soft attack, and it scales very well with superior firepower, which is my favorite doctrine. Support anti-air. This is not entirely necessary, but it is very good because it reduces the damage you take from the enemy close air support. Even if you have the air superiority, you still benefit from it. Moreover, it gives you some piercing. Quite a decent amount of piercing, to be honest, which is enough to pierce most divisions earlier in the game, so it works a bit like an anti-tank at the same time as an anti-air, so pretty good value. Now, I really like the cavalry recon detachment. Well, you can see the bonuses you get down there, but especially you get a plus 10% soft attack on all of your line artillery. That's quite a lot of soft attack. You can also use, if you have the industry for it, the Motorized recon company, which is indeed better. As you can see, we get a bit more reconnaissance, we get more defense breakthrough. On the other hand, however, we need trucks and we start consuming fuel. So if you don't want your infantry to consume fuel, you can stick to cavalry recon and you still get the same nice offensive bonuses. As for the last support company, as you can see, we are using in the logistics company here. It reduces the supply use by a lot, but this is also pretty situational. You could also use a field hospital, which is actually pretty good to use infantry offensively. It will reduce the casualties by a lot, save your manpower, and also save the experience on these divisions. You could also use a rocket artillery if you want some more soft attack. This becomes particularly good later in the game, but as you can see, the soft attack increase is pretty good. You could also use a medium flame tank company. You can see the bonuses to attack down there, they're pretty solid. And you could even go for a support anti-tank if you really need to fight tanks. My default one is logistics because, I mean, consuming less supplies is always good, but all of these other choices are entirely viable. Okay, let's move on to my next template. Here we are talking about defensive infantry. I'm using this template in all of my runs. Whether I'm using my infantry to attack or my tanks to attack, I always need some defensive units to protect the less important fronts or to simply offer some basic protection along the entire front. I find this defensive infantry to be very flexible. You know, you can use them to protect your coastline or to protect a front where you don't expect particular pressure from the enemy divisions. If you want, you can also remove one infantry battalion and you can go down to a combat width of 10. This used to be the best until the latest patch, but now 12 is slightly better. In any case, it remains very flexible and very good defensively. Of course, we need the engineer company. The support artillery is so good that I would always use it on everything, but here it's a bit less needed because we don't need soft attack as much as we need defense. And support anti-air, this is mostly needed because if you use this template to defend the fronts where you're not particularly active, well, it's more likely that you don't have the air superiority on those fronts, so you get more value out of your support anti-air. In any case, very flexible and very cheap template to make, so I always use it in all of my runs. Next, we have the standard infantry. What do I mean by this? If I'm using a country which has a strong industry and I go directly for tanks, I do not build my offensive infantry. So instead, I usually stick to the basic standard infantry that those countries already have in order to save on army experience. So these can work a bit like the defensive infantry I showed you earlier, but it also has some better offensive stats. Moreover, these widths are now very good. 14, 15 and 18 are all very good widths. Now you could go down to a combat width of 15, but it would be, as you can see, fairly expensive. So usually I would just stick to the default template that you have with your starting nation. If it's already 15, that's great. If it is 14, it's good. If it is 18, it's also good. Later on, you can decide to upgrade this infantry to become the offensive infantry if you wish to do so, or you can downgrade it, I mean remove some battalions to make it your defensive infantry. Now let's get into some serious stuff and talk about the first armory division I'm sharing with you. This is a lot of fun to use. You can make it in 1939, but you need a strong industry to make this. Not all countries can afford to make enough armored divisions by 1939. You can make about 12 with Germany and with the Soviet Union, and then depending on the country you're playing, you may be able to make a bit less. Now let me say one important thing here, and that's a good example of how the combat width is not the only thing you should be paying attention to. The ideal width for tanks is 35. 36 is also fine, but 35 is a bit better. However, to achieve a combat width of 35, you need to add a motorized artillery, or for a combat width of 36, you need to add 2 more medium tanks, as you can see. What's the issue with that? The issue is that we want these tanks done by 1939, and if we add 2 more tank battalions, we are going to lose some divisions. I will not be able to make 12 divisions in time for the war if I add 2 more battalions. So in my opinion, it's not worth adding 2 more tank battalions just to achieve a better combat width. So the reason I also included 30 as the ideal width for these tanks is that by removing from this tab 1 battalion, either a tank battalion or a motorized battalion, you get to a combat width of 30. Of course, you have slightly worse stats, but 30 is another very good combat width. I would suggest removing a tank if you feel you're a bit low on organization. This is not the case because 40 is pretty good. Or you can remove a motorized if you feel like your organization is going to stay pretty high. I would suggest an organization of about 35. In this case, we're happy, but this is fairly late in the game, so we have all of the bonuses. If you do this in 1939, with most countries, you will need to sacrifice a medium tank instead. So I explained why 2 tank battalions here are an issue, but why is it a problem to add a motorized artillery? That's not very expensive to make. Well, the issue is that it costs a lot of army experience. It counts as a new group, so you need to spend 25 army experience. And that 25 army experience may be the difference between having or not having a specific doctrine at the beginning of the war. And trust me, doctrines, especially some of them, are way more important than having a slightly larger combat width. Okay, let's go back to the standard divisions and let's talk very quickly about the support companies. You already know for the engineer and the support artillery, I already talked about them. For tanks, it's very important to add the medium flame tank company. Very, very good buffs. It also increases the breakthrough on your motorized and mechanized, which gets you even more value. But the bonuses, the buffs that you see down there are the ones that really matter for us. We add logistics. This is basically a must for tank divisions, because otherwise the supply use will be quite insane. Look at what happens if I remove it. We go to a supply use of 3 instead of 1.7. That's massive. And finally, I really like to add a motorized recon company to my tank battalions. Not for the soft attack buff, it only applies to that motorized artillery, which doesn't really matter, but for the buffs that you can see down there, the movement speed buffs that apply on most terrains, and in some of them they are pretty massive. Look at the plains and desert buffs to movement speed. You want your tanks to be as fast as possible because you want to overrun and encircle enemy divisions. Now let's move on to the next armored template that I'm sharing with you. It's now 1941 and we can afford slightly better gear. Meaning at this point producing 2 more tank battalions shouldn't be an issue anymore, so we can switch to a combat width of 36. And we can add mechanized instead of motorized to further boost our stats and to increase the overall hardness of the template. The support companies are exactly the same. One important thing to say, however, compared to my 1939 tank divisions, is that I usually make these ones with the countries that could not afford tanks in 1939. Say, for example, this is a run with Japan, and with Japan I used this offensive infantry template in the early game. By 1939 I could not afford to make these templates, but in 1941, after dominating World War II, I could finally afford to make armored divisions, and I skipped directly to my 1941 template. Okay, next let's talk about my 1943 armored division template. Keep in mind that you can absolutely stick to the 1941 template. It's actually slightly better than this one. But if you use the motorized artillery, you now have a better choice. You can replace the motorized artillery with a medium SPG or self-propelled artillery. Now, SPGs have better soft attack than motorized artillery, so you get better stats. On the other hand, it is better to remove the SPG entirely and to just stick to 2 medium tank battalions. As you can see, we have better stats in general, but if you're a fan of SPGs, and they are pretty fun to use in my opinion, then you can make this template instead. Finally, let's briefly talk about the 1945 Armored Division template. It's exactly the same as the previous ones, but we replaced all medium tanks with modern tanks. I will share my tank designs in a different video, so you can see exactly how I design these modern tanks. In my opinion, they are not worth it, so it's better to stick to medium tanks. So basically there is really no reason to switch from this template ever in the game. But if you want, if you have any industry, if you want to do it for fun, you can make modern tanks and you will have better stats, especially hardness and armor will be significantly better. Okay, next, let's talk about my motorized template. And this is a very weird template. If you look at it right now, you say, what's the point of this thing? It's useless. It is not entirely useless, actually. I love using motorized together with my tanks. I assign my motorized divisions and tank divisions to the same exact front line. Infantry cannot keep up with the speed of the tanks. So sometimes, if you're not careful, some gaps form in your front and the enemies can take advantage of that. With these motorized divisions, you are always safe and your fronts are always covered. Our main goal with this motorized is to keep it cheap because it's not one of the main divisions. It's not extremely important. It's just convenient to have. Moreover, if you break the enemy front, you have a max speed of 12 kilometers per hour with this template, so you can use this motorized also to rush victory points or to make sure an encirclement happens. But the main goal is to cover the front as your tanks push. So as I explained, this is mostly a defensive division, so that's why we don't have any offensive support companies. Also, we want to keep it as cheap as possible. But as I said, it works really well with tanks. Okay, next, let's look at Mountaineers. In this case, you absolutely want a combat width of 25, which means we'll not get any penalties in the mountains, which is where we are likely to use, or we should at least use this template. To achieve a combat width of 25 while keeping very good soft attack, we go for something like this. This is not the only choice. You can achieve a combat width of 25 in other ways, but this is my favorite. And in terms of support companies, well, as always, the engineer company and the support artillery. Anti-air is not entirely needed, but again, it gives you some piercing and maybe you will not have the entire air superiority, so overall very good value. We're also adding rangers. You unlock this support company with the special forces doctrines, with the Mountaineers, of course. So I included it here and not in my other templates because I assume that if you're going for good Mountaineers, you're also investing a little bit in them. But if you don't, then you can also use the usual recon cavalry detachment. You get a bit less soft attack, but not even that much less. You can see it right there. The difference is fairly minor. If you can afford and if you have them unlocked, however, you can see that very nice plus 20% soft attack bonus there on the left to our line artillery, which is very good. Okay, next let's talk about Marines. Very similar. We go for a combat width of 12. This is pretty standard. It's very balanced. These Marines are very good at getting the naval invasions done, but they are not very good at pushing after the naval invasion is completed. So this is mostly to get naval invasions if you don't want to invest too heavily into Marines. We are using Pioneers, similarly to what I said for Mountaineers. This is a special support company that you unlock as you invest into the Marines special doctrines. And then we're using support artillery and anti-air. Anti-air is particularly important here because quite often you don't have the air superiority if you're going for a naval invasion far from your homeland. To be completely honest with you guys, I don't use Marines too much, but when I have them already unlocked, Japan is a good example, I really like using this template to make my naval invasion a bit easier. If you really want to invest into Marines and you want to use them offensively, not only to disembark, but actually to advance in the jungles, for a river crossing, so if you want to make them a proper offensive division, then I would suggest going for something like this. As you can see, basically it mirrors our offensive infantry template. It also has the same support companies with the addition of the Pioneers. And in this case, I would not go for logistics. I would go for the field hospital for sure, to preserve, well, the manpower, but especially the experience that your Marines can gather as they fight, so that this can become a very elite, very powerful offensive division later in the game. Now, if you want to invest in Marines even more, of course, you can make special dedicated armored divisions and so on. But this template will get your pushes done in the rivers, in the jungles, disembarking. So very, very solid template. We're almost done. We can go very quickly with the last ones. I never use Paratroopers, but if you wanted to use some, this is a fairly solid division. You can use them to cut the enemy supplies, to create encirclements. Again, you could invest a bit more in Paratroopers, but I didn't create a more offensive version of my Paratroopers, since I really rarely use them. Next, military police. Now, this is not actually a real division, in the sense that we are not going to recruit them. We only use them for territory management, so here. And due to the way this works, it doesn't matter how many cavalry battalions you have in here. So having 1 or having 10 is exactly the same in terms of suppression once you use them for territory management. So my suggestion is to keep the default one your country already has. The cheaper it is, the better it is, but it doesn't really matter. If you do not have one for only 5 army experience, you can create this template. But if you already have one, stick to it. Cavalry is very good for suppression. And then very late in the game, if you really want to, if you really have nothing else to do, but I usually don't do this, you can add the military police support company. And at that point, the military police support company scales with the amount of battalions that you have in here. So now it matters how many cavalry battalions you have in the template. And if you're in the late game and you don't care, I would suggest filling it up entirely with cavalry to maximize the suppression. But again, this is very situational, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so this was the last template I had for you today, guys. By the way, if you're wondering why we have Japan in the background, I chose this run because it's fairly late in the game, so I had access to most of these templates. And also, this was a pretty good run that I had with Japan. I went for a full world conquest. Of course, if you're interested, you can find the video on my channel. But that's another topic. For now, if you have any questions about these division templates, feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, if you have any suggestions for further improvements, feel free to let me know. Feedback is always welcome. And well, if you enjoyed this video, again, please do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Also, make sure not to miss my dedicated videos on combat widths, tank designs, and plane designs, which will integrate this one, of course. Other than that, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.